Hello and welcome to the crux of Medtech. We go beyond the buzzwords, bringing you the insights from the innovators, investors, and leaders who are driving this life-saving space forward. Because I'm absolutely fascinated by the stories that people have to tell in Medtech. As someone who works in this sector on a daily basis, I come across so many interesting people and so many interesting stories that I think the world deserves to know about. Welcome to the crux of Medtech. Hello, David, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So let's kick off then. First thing I'd like to do is get a bit of a background on who David is and how you got into this industry.
That's a very short question with a very potentially long answer. So I guess, taking it all the way back, generally when you get into a field, like the first thing you do is look at what your family are doing. And my family are, a big proportion of them are medics. So my mum was a GP, my dad was a pharmacist, my aunt was a GP. All my cousins, several cousins are medics. So it was kind of the trajectory that I guess in some ways was expected. I didn't want to go and be a medic, but I was interested in the technology around it. And my uncle was one of the co-founders of a company called Scientific Generics, which is now Sygentia, which is one of the big Cambridge-based consultancies. And so when I was 14, I did some work experience at Scientific Generics for a couple of weeks. And it was a fascinating experience. I assume you've met people from Sygentia in the past, but back in those days, I think it was much more of a sort of Wild West. This was 1994 or something like that. And it was just full of the most quirky, wacky, awesome, smart people you would ever meet in your life. And then I remember being taken down the corridor, and it was like being in James Bond's lab. You'd open a door and then someone would be doing like a device for PCR using electricity. Like, can we do that? Let's try it. Or photodynamic therapy or space program stuff, or someone's trying to make a carbonated drink more fizzy, or a tractor more clever, and it was literally every door they opened, there would be someone else in there doing something completely different. And I thought, well, that's the job I want. That's what I want to do, And so, from then on, really, that sort of colored everything that I did. So I did a very sort of multidisciplinary degree, Leeds University, sort of did biophysics, so mixture of physics and biochemistry. Then went and did my PhD at Oxford in X-ray crystallography, so protein structure function, biosensing. And coming out of that, I'd always really wanted to go into medical devices, so I went into medical diagnostics, worked with Philips Healthcare for a while, down in, ultimately in Cambridge. So that's how I ended up in Cambridge. And we were at the time developing advanced point of care devices for full blood count. So kind of putting it down into a very small form factor, microfluidic chip. That worked pretty, and that actually is interesting. The conversation we were just having before the podcast was about, how you take technologies from other areas and repurpose them. That was building on screen display technology that was embedded in like Nokia phones or active matrix LCDs, and thinking about, well, how could we repurpose them to, kind of produce multiplex arrays of electrodes and sort of individually addressable electrodes, things like that. So that was great. I was there for 2.5 years. Working in a big company was not my thing. There's a lot of process, a lot of, you feel like a very small cog in a very big machine. But a great experience. But I then went out and worked in a diagnostics company called Sphere Medical. And I was sort of edging closer to Sygentia, as it then was, at that point, without really realizing, because Sphere Medical was a spin-out, a joint venture between Siemens and Sygentia. And we were developing kind of patient-connected blood gas devices. So I ran the sensor development there. And the idea was that you would have a tiny silicon chip that would sit in an arterial line. You would pull the blood over the chip and then push it back into the patient. And my job was really to work with a he asked the development team to work out how to functionalize these sensors and make them measure oxygen or potassium or sodium or hematocrit, things like that. That was a great experience. We got to FDA approvals. I also developed a technology for measuring the anesthetic propofol, which was, you may recall, is the anesthetic that killed Michael Jackson, which really screwed up my literature searches. But yeah, we worked out a way of measuring at the point of care propofol, so you could determine someone's depths of sedation during surgery or in intensive care, things like that. So I mean that was a great experience. You sort of learn all the different aspects of medical device product development. We got to IPO with that, which was a nice sort of point for me to kind of go, well, what's next? And at that point, someone from Syngenta contacted me and said, do you want to join? Which for me was a bit creepy because I'd always sort of had in my head, like that was sort of the archetypal job that I would want. But I was a little bit worried, like, does this feel a bit like nepotism if my uncle found it? At that time, he'd been away for, about 15 years or so. So, I mean, there weren't that many people that knew him. And when I ended up talking to the managing director, he said something really funny. He was like, well, if anything, the fact that you're related to Bob would count against you. That was a lovely way of putting it. So I just went, yeah, okay, I'm fine, I'll join. And then from then on, it was 8 years of just absolute adventure. I got to travel the world. I was abroad probably once or twice a month. I visited pretty much all the big sort of blue chip medtech and pharma companies, and with a job like that, you get access to sort of VP, C-suite level people, right? And so hugely stimulating and actually quite a privileged level of access, because when you think about it, there's not many jobs where you can kind of peek behind the curtain. Obviously, you wouldn't tell anyone what you saw, but you would start to spot trends and themes that maybe weren't in the public domain, and you could sort of, act on that and sort of have insights that maybe, wouldn't otherwise have been able to be brought forward. So great experience. And, bearing in mind when I joined that company, I was like mega sort of hardcore tech devices, in vitro diagnostics. That's how I started. And you sort of, when you go into Syngenta, it's real sink or swim, right? You sort of start by selling yourself. So you sort of go out there and you're like, oh, tell me how your sensor works. Okay, I get that. Have you thought about doing this or that? And that's how I'd get projects. But then as it sort of went on, you sort of have to realize you're representing an organization of maybe 150 consultants. And you've actually got to take an interest in the surgical robotics and the tractor projects and the lipstick projects and the carbonation projects. So, you sort of have to develop a whole new set of skills. But while I was kind of going through this kind of scary transition, there was an event, I think hosted by Cambridge Wireless, where I was just chucked in at the last minute, because that's what people do to consultants, just go in and run this workshop. I'm like, yeah, okay, let's do it. And it was, it was probably about 2012, 2013, something like that. And it was like, okay, well, what are the opportunities in connected health, as people were calling it back then? What are the opportunities in connected health? How do we do this? And I remember sitting in this room just in front of a horseshoe of like the great and the good of Cambridge, knowing absolutely nothing about digital health, like absolutely nothing. Okay. And they were just like, so what should we do? And we sort of ran this workshop, and I came up with some sort of concepts in the hoof, and everyone was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And I was like, oh, okay, well, there's something in this. So I sort of got away with that. And then that sort of entered a lot of my, I looked more into the industry and more into kind of where the applications might be. And I ended up talking to a lot of different companies. And it was around about the time that smartphones were sort of becoming interesting to the medical community. Like, what could we do with this? It's crazy to think, like, what the iPhone came out, 2008, something like that? It's not that long ago, really. Well, it came out for 20 years, but I guess that is a while ago. But, at the time, it was like, whoa, this wacky consumer device, like, and the surgical space, the concept back then of getting a smartphone or an iPad anywhere near a surgical system would have just given people kittens, right? And so what was interesting is that through the conversations I had, we spotted some opportunities to actually do this safely and in a risk managed way. So the first project we ever won in that space was connecting an iPhone to an implantable device, and it was a sensing device, and we partitioned the risk in the system. So really, the smartphone was a UI, but obviously it had to display that information correctly, and then a lot of the cleverness was in the sort of embedded software in a wearable device that would then sort of power the implanted sensor and then collect the data off it. And so we had just had a really fun time sort of architecting that system. And I remember at the time, like, saying to my CEO, we had this whole conversation. He was like, why do you want to sell these projects? It's just an app. It's just an app, right? It's like, there's no money in apps. That project, I think, was well over £1 million. And then, so they were like, oh, actually, maybe there is something in this. And so on the back of that, we sort of became the people that did this, right? So, and like all the hard stuff, we then sort of went into interfacing iPads with like implantable neurostimulators. We've done, implant ICDs as well, like, and fascinating projects, and to the point now where you're using like an iPad to actually program these devices. The regulations have kind of caught up round about the time that the FDA started thinking about how to regulate them and publishing guidance. We ended up getting invited to one of these kind of roadshow workshops that they were running in Boston. And I remember sitting beside, you know how you have just occasionally like these sort of out-of-body experience. I think you were mentioning being at a research conference, having a very similar experience, right? Yeah. So I was sitting beside the guy that was writing the guidelines at the FDA and the guy that was doing it for a multinational medical diagnostics company. And they were sort of looking at me and going like, oh, what's your opinion? Like a year and a bit previously, I was like, what's digital health? It was quite an experience, but it was sort of trial by fire, really. And I like to think I was kind of really in at the ground floor of this explosion of digital health. And,
yeah,
I ended up, through all these different projects, I ended up thinking quite deeply about like, how do we make these systems work? And then obviously the pharmaceutical industry started taking an interest, and they started thinking, oh, well, how can we use an app to enable a drug? Like, can we do like bolus calculations? And, obviously started with like insulin. But then it was thinking, well, how can we support the patient more holistically, when they're on the drug? And so you ended up with, your drug branded apps, for, where to inject or things like that.
Yeah.
So, if we now think about the segmentation, if we're sort of segueing from me to sort of the wider landscape, what I saw evolve really was, initially it was all about wearables. It was all about like covering people in vital signs monitoring devices. Then it sort of went into companion diagnostic or companion apps that would sort of sit alongside a therapy and kind of guide the patient to the administration of it, or the sort of more holistic ways around it as well. I think the home wearable stuff then went into a higher risk setting where it was more virtual wards, where you would sort of maybe discharge a patient earlier, or if you have a higher risk patient, you sort of elevate their care and have, remote monitoring of those patients, using these devices. Lot of regulatory innovation there as well. Obviously some of it enabled by smartphones, some of it not. So, the landscape really sort of exploded. And then kind of laterally, they were all kind of looking at algorithms, and big data was the big thing, where they're like, okay, what can we do with these huge data sets we're producing? But actually in the midst of all this, no one thought to actually check whether anyone was onboarding any actual users.
Okay. So they're all thinking, here's a load of really cool things that we can do. We haven't got anyone using the stuff we're doing anyway.
Should we do it?
Yeah, should we do it? Yeah, that's the question.
So it was kind of interesting because every company not every company, there's some notable successes, but a lot of the companies I was dealing with, were sort of deploying these technologies and no one was really using them. And I think a lot of it was that, particularly, when Facebook came out, or, the big social media, people develop this kind of vocabulary in the consumer space around how many daily active users do you have, how much engagement, how, and actually what I realized, I was doing work on connected inhalers as well, where, you'd have an attachment that would go onto the bottom of an inhaler, and then it would measure your adherence, and all very clever. But a lot of the insights we were getting from end users were, well, actually, I don't want to be reminded that I'm sick every day.
Okay.
I'm an asthmatic, so I installed this device and I started using it, and if I forgot to put the device on the inhaler, or if I didn't bother taking my inhaler because I'm a really crap mild asthmatic, which is ironic given the company I run now, it would start badgering me. It would say things like, your inhaler was designed with you in mind, use your inhaler. Why aren't you using your inhaler? This is why you should use it.
Well, it sounds a bit like people have got these whoops nowadays, and if they go out drinking, then it says your recovery rate is 3%. Well, yeah, I know. I just went out drinking last night. You don't need to tell me that I've been a lazy slob and got a takeaway this morning. You could probably leave me for a day off today.
Well, exactly. And I think it's more acute in the medical space, at least. Yeah. At least if you're a consumer, you sort of made an active choice because, oh, well, this is a cool device. I want to use it. I have a sort of lifestyle goal I want to meet. There is a certain type of person who will be into that. And that is probably true of the medical space as well. In fact, we have users at mhealth who, just use it religiously, every day. We have someone at the moment in the US who's, I think, in their 100th day of consecutive use. I think that's some new record we've done. So, it happens, but, for the most part, what we're hearing really loudly is I don't want to be reminded that I'm sick every day. I don't want a load of chores that I have to do. It's a useful resource, but only when it's, useful to me, when I perceive a need. And then the other part we're hearing a lot of is, here's another really good example. So did you ever hear of Proteus Digital Health? Did you ever hear
I didn't.
of that?
No.
So they had something, we're talking about tech push, right? And just because you could do something, should you, right? So they developed a smart pill that was the potato clocks, where you would basically put two different electrodes and then it would power something. Yeah. So it was a similar concept, but it was a tiny little sensor that would sit in the pill. You take the pill and then it would hit your stomach acid and it would emit a signal that would then be picked up by a wearable. And through lots of very clever sort of market assessment, pharma partners, whatever happened there, they decided that one of the first applications for this was paranoid schizophrenia. And what's the number one thing a paranoid schizophrenic is scared of? It's being watched. Take the pill and it's tracked, And so, at the time, there was a lot of technology that was more looking for a solution. It was we got this explosion of stuff that we can do. And actually, I think certainly over the last 5-6 years, there's been a lot of consolidation. I think virtual wards were super big in the NHS, particularly around COVID. And I think there is a place for it. There's a really strong place for it, but you have to remember you're only really servicing the top tier of the highest risk population. And then you've got people who need to monitor that data, right? There's a liability that falls on the clinician for making sure that patient is safe. There's a responsibility there, even puts down the legals. And so what you end up actually doing is creating more work, not less, And so what's happened with virtual wards is that really it's a load of extra workforce, a load of extra privatized workforce that just happens to have some devices hanging off it and some connected, but actually that's not that empowering for the end user, and it's not scalable. And so, there's been quite an interesting shift, I would say, over the last 5 years or so, where people are beginning to realize this, and much more pragmatic digital solutions are coming out that are more tailored to the individual. And so, it's for me, it's been very interesting watching that big curve of everyone getting, being a bit scared of smartphones. How do we do this medically? Oh, actually, it's okay. The FDA say it's okay. And then suddenly a big explosion of devices hanging off smartphones, most of which turned out to be completely useless, or the margins were so poor in terms of what reimbursement you could get that they just weren't viable. And then it's sort of swinging back to, okay, well, actually, what can we do with clever algorithms? What can we do with software? What can we do? And what is the language we use around how we quantify engagement? Because it isn't Facebook, right? It's a completely different mindset if you're managing your disease from managing, your social connections, So yeah, it's been quite an interesting, I mean, to go back to your original question, like, in terms of the arc that I followed, from super hard tech into connected health, carried on with the super hard tech, actually realized out the back of that if we just made this a bit simpler, a lot more people would use it. So let's start there. It's quite an interesting look to have gone through, really.
I'm interrupting this episode to bring you a word from our sponsors, TTP. TTP is a leader in complex medical technology development with deep scientific and engineering expertise. They support ambitious medtech companies in solving high-risk, high-complexity challenges where there's no margin for error. Whether you're tackling uncharted technical territory or racing to bring a product to market, TTP provide clarity and direction. By de-risking innovation and ensuring seamless alignment with regulatory and manufacturing demands, TTP help you move forward with speed and confidence. To find out more, check out the show notes.
So you left Sagentia to go into the world of entrepreneurship, really, and start working for the companies producing digital health tools. So what really came about? Why did you decide to make that jump? You're working in what you described to start with as the dream job. What took you away from Sagentia and started you on the journey of working direct for an operator?
Well, when you think about 14-year-old Dave, thinking, right, what I'd love to do is, work in one of the big tech consultancies and have this really varied work experience. I sort of got to a stage where after 8 and a bit years, I felt like I'd done it. I'd achieved what I'd set out to do when I was 14. And to me, that was quite discombobulating, really, to be that driven for that long. I was sort of in my mid-30s at the time, or sort of late 30s. And then, sort of just thinking, well, what do I do next? Like, do I want to spend the next 20 years here? Because I could have very easily, it's like being in an Oxford college. You see why people never leave their college, because they have nice dinners and they have a lovely experience and it's all very intellectually stimulating. It's not that different in some ways, But I just felt like, unless, how would I feel in 20 years' time if I look back and said, I spent another 20 years in that area? And to be honest, I'd be like, yeah, intellectually really stimulating, really enjoyed it. But another part of me just thought, well, what else is out there? And, I'd quite like to go on another adventure. It's something I can always go back to. And indeed, I might do one day, because I really did enjoy it. But, there was a lot of ideas about how to make digital technology work that I didn't think many people were pushing in the industry. And I thought, well, maybe I can contribute to this in a more sort of end-to-end way. When you work in a consultancy business, you tend to be sort of parachuted in to solve a problem and then maybe to develop the products. But you don't really get to follow through the commercialization of that product. You don't see how it's embedded. You don't do a lot of iteration. For a company like the one I work for, we tend to be in the harder end of the spectrum. So, simple product iterations and understanding how to tweak something wasn't really part of our DNA. It was the big, cool, clever stuff, and I just felt I had a real itch I wanted to scratch, really, and to go out and really get under the skin of, like, what is it going to take to bring a product like this to market and make it work. So the initial jump was to a company called Bright Insight, where we were developing again technologies for the pharmaceutical industry. And it was quite interesting because, there's great work there. Like a lot of the work that we got was very much tailored towards drug management rather than disease management. And, for certain applications like rare disease, like, makes perfect sense, or other niches where, you do need those kind of feedback loops and you need to sort of monitor doses and things. And if you think about it practically, if you've got a biologic drug and you're competing with 3 other biologic drugs, and then, you're a clinician sitting in a center, you'll make a decision on which of those 4 biologic drugs to use. And actually, if every drug has a different app, suddenly you're answering 4 different questions about 4 different drugs and another 4 different questions about 4 different apps. And it just becomes so fragmented. And, so I think people in pharma even were beginning to sort of realize, like, well, this kind of use case doesn't really work. And again, it really got me thinking. So I was there for a couple of years, but I sort of felt like, no, this isn't the way to do it. And a pharma company who I will not name in the public forum, I had a very good relationship with the guy there, and he was saying, "Oh God, this company, mhealth, they've really got it nailed. Like, they've got this real sort of wellness, sort of disease management application rather than like it's more holistic. It's not just developing a drug and a drug product." I was like, "Oh, that's really interesting." And I couldn't kind of shake it. I was just like, why do I know this company? Like, why have I heard of this company? It was round about towards the tail end of lockdown, I think. And I realized it was my neighbor who was on the board, who was just up the road, a guy called Paul Gordon. Paul, this is a very meandering story, but Paul Gordon is, amongst other things, the founder of the New York Bagel Company, like the 5 bagels that you get from Tesco's. Amongst loads of other stuff, like he's worked in Medtech and digital health for years as well. I was a sort of serial entrepreneur, but everyone remembers the bagels. Phoned him up. I said, right, we got to meet. So we had a socially distanced trip to the local mill in Holton. Don't know if you've ever been up to Holton Mill, but it's very nice. We had National Trust.
Actually.
Sorry.
I've been there for breakfast, actually.
Have you? Okay, you know exactly where it was.
Yeah.
So we had a National Trust pasty each, and we had a very profound conversation about like how to make digital health work. And the first thing that got me was we have 70,000 users. And that might not sound much to someone who thinks in terms of LinkedIn subscriptions or Facebook or whatever, but for digital health, that is an enormous number. Like most of the projects I've been exposed to, they were lucky if they had 100, maybe 1,000 at a push for some niche applications. So that really got my attention. And I said, well, what's holding you back? Because, I haven't really heard of you guys. Like, what's holding you back? And he said, well, you can think of it like mhealth have been busy building foundations while everyone else has built a skyscraper. No one can see the foundations, but when it goes up, it's going to be really solid. I thought that's actually a really nice way of describing it. So it was, mhealth came about, it's been around for a while, right? So 2013, really, largely bootstrapped and, through grant revenue. And the founders were 2 respiratory physicians, Tom Wilkinson and Simon Bourne. Tom is a professor of respiratory medicine who's very active, nationally and internationally on COPD pathway development and care. And so, as Paul said, like they were great product people. Like they completely understood the unmet needs. They had a lot of empathy for what these patients were going through, and I think COPD patients have some particular characteristics that you've got to think very carefully. They tend to be higher levels of deprivation, sort of lower socioeconomic bands. There's very strong lifestyle factors, so like risk factors like smoking, things like that. And they tend to skew older as well. And so, through this grant money and through this kind of deep thought and their own personal lived experience, they'd actually built a platform which was really fit for purpose and really respectful. Like, we're here when you need us. And, it had an element of clinician oversight, but quite sort of soft touch. It wasn't something someone had to stare at every day and make sure they weren't missing any data. It was more of a sort of supportive interaction. Like, oh, great, you're getting on well with your rehab, but maybe you should do some more structured education on smoking cessation. It'll be that kind of conversation rather than, oh my goodness, your SpO2 levels are through the floor or whatever. We weren't doing any of that. So anyway, so he described all this to me, and he said, well, they're great product people, And, they've built these amazing foundations, but really we need to think about how to take it to the next level commercially. Like, how would we do that? And obviously through all these pharma partnerships I had and kind of various other areas, I said, well, actually, I'd be really interested to help. This sounds like exactly what I've been looking for. And he said, well, great. Do you want to be CEO? And I went, oh, okay. So yeah, it was just the right place, right time, really, because Simon and Tom were looking for someone to take the business to the next level commercially, and I was looking for an opportunity like that. I was looking for a vehicle where I can make a difference, and so fast forward to today, we are probably about 160,000 users. So yeah, we've almost had another 100,000 users. We're onboarding patients at a rate of 3,500 a month, thereabouts. We've got contracts with probably 70% of the NHS regions in England. Some are active, some aren't. Depends on how much the ICBs are reorganising, really. But it's been a fascinating adventure, and we've also moved to the States. So we've done our first couple of deployments there. Still early days there. We're probably about 40 users, 50 users, something like that. And we have some really good partnerships in clinical research as well, where we're working with the pharmaceutical companies, but in a very sort of transparent and not weird way. I think it's really important. It's in a way that benefits patients, it benefits clinicians, and it's good, from a commercial perspective for us and our partners. So yeah, it's been a very interesting journey. Where I've sort of,
I'm sure. And so just to give a bit of an idea, so you've talked kind of a high level about some of the indications that this digital health app actually has, but like, talk us through it kind of to give us an idea of what it actually does for the patients. What kind of benefit are they getting from using this digital health tool? And what is it kind of doing? Why is it getting so much engagement from all those active users where others have failed so much? You talked a bit about the simplicity, but yeah, talk me through what the interface kind of actually does, what the value is to using this every day as an active user, and what we're getting out the back end if you're a patient who's on the app.
So I'm going to answer that in a slightly obtuse way and then get to the point. Our head of customer success, Jane, unearthed the most amazing quote from a guy called Dr. Warner Slack, right, from the 1970s. And Warner Slack was one of the pioneers of electronic medical records. And he was, I think, really ahead of his time in thinking about who owns this data, who's responsible for it. He was talking about GDPR and HIPAA before those were even a thing, right? In the 1970s, like what do they have there? Just like rooms full of computer, right? And that was it. So he has some great quotes. One of them was that the patient's the most underutilized resource in healthcare, which I thought was quite interesting. And then the other one was, at first I thought the computer would help the doctor in the care of the patient. But then I realized the computer could be used by the patient to help themselves. And actually, when you think about the two parts of that quote, most of the digital health industry is stuck in the first part of that quote. It's the computer helping the doctor in the care of the patient. How much information can I suck so that I can make a sort of, paternal or maternalistic decision about what to do with this patient, and then I'll tell them what to do. That's kind of where I think a lot of I'm not saying clinicians, but I think certainly the digital health industry is. The second half of that sentence is much more interesting to me, is what can the computer, as Warner Slack would have said, what can that do to empower the patient to do things they otherwise wouldn't have done, which keeps them healthy and out of hospital and out of healthcare? Because ultimately what the patient wants, I think, is to be, empowered to look after themselves and not go to see the doctor if they can possibly avoid it, right? So that's kind of the ethos of mhealth in a nutshell, really. And the purpose of it's not a virtual ward, so we don't cover patients and devices. We don't have people staring at their data. What we do is we put a digital product in their hands. You can go in it through smartphone, through any internet-enabled device, browser, whatever, and it will essentially support you to reach whatever goal you might have. So for COPD, which is the original flagship product, as I said, COPD is a very debilitating respiratory disease. For those that don't know, it's the third leading cause of death in the world, which is crazy, because it's not something that people talk about. Everyone goes on about like diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and we can all talk about the reasons for that, but I think generally respiratory doesn't get as much investment as other sectors. CPD patients tend to be quite invisible because, particularly in the late stage of disease, they're quite housebound. Like, even leaving the house is a challenge because they just don't have the breath. Like getting to the bottom of their driveway to pick up their post, in the States is something we've heard. Like, that's a goal for some patients. And there'll be days where they'll have exacerbations and, they'll basically just not be able to stand up, because they just don't have the energy. Now, there's an intervention for CPD called pulmonary rehabilitation, in addition to inhaled meds and soon to be biologics. But pulmonary rehabilitation is a very well established, very well evidenced intervention where you take a patient through kind of a structured program of exercise, designed to kind of strengthen the muscles around your lungs and kind of make the best of what you have. And then we'll do kind of structured education around that to kind of coach you in, how best to manage your disease, chest clearance, that kind of thing. And so if you give someone pulmonary rehabilitation at the right time, you can reduce their risk of hospital readmission or hospital admission by 50%, right? 50%. So if that were a biologic drug, it would be a blockbuster biologic drug, right? But it's not. It's a series of exercise classes, right? And that's not very sexy. When you look at the stats, I'll give you US stats. So in the US, the uptake of pulmonary rehabilitation is 3%. So only 3% of patients who are eligible for pulmonary rehab are getting it, which means that hospital admissions are pretty much double what they should be. And when you also consider that 1 in 8 of all hospital admissions are for COPD patients, right? You had all those news stories about like all these ambulances queuing up to get into A&E. 8 ambulances, 1 of them will have a COPD patient.
Another quick interruption to tell you about our sponsors, KUKA. KUKA is a global leader in robotics with over 25 years of experience partnering with medtech companies on their journey to market. Their reputation is built on robust technology, reliability, and long-term collaboration. More than a supplier, KUKA provides trusted support throughout the product lifecycle, from development to integration and beyond. For companies exploring robotic solutions, the KUKA LBR Med offers a ready-to-integrate, state-of-the-art option that meets the highest medical standards, without the need to build from scratch. If you want to find out more, then head to the show notes and follow the link to KUKA's website.
So why are only 3% getting the rehabilitation at the moment? Is it just a lack of knowledge about the rehabilitation? Is it lack of awareness or education? What's causing only 3% of Americans to get kind of the rehabilitation that has such a big impact?
Yeah, it's very multifactorial. There's some commonality with the UK. There's some things that diverge. So the UK, I mean, there are various stats around this, and there's some sort of controversy about how you measure it, but I don't think the uptake of pulmonary rehab is much better in the UK. I think we're probably maybe at 8 to 9% if we're doing well, right? But focusing on the US, one of the big problems in the US is reimbursement. So, and this is actually fascinating. Like in the US, you do have centers, and they'll do cardiac rehab and pulmonary rehab. Cardiac rehab pays clinical teams 3 times as much to do relative to pulmonary rehab. So, and on top of that, the workforce and the facilities is very constrained as well. So what you have is a constrained workforce, so you don't have much capacity anyway. And that capacity is preferentially filled up with cardiac patients because that's the only way that these centers can actually make a return on investment, right? So that's the financial argument. The other argument is more sort of social. So, as I've said, CPD patients tend to skew into lower socioeconomic bands, older bands. So, they might not get getting around, if you're having to go, 2-3 times a week to sessions for between 6 and 12 weeks, depending on which program you're on. That's actually a really big commitment and potentially quite costly. And, our head of customer success, sort of is painted that she was a rehab therapist. And she paints pictures of, this patient struggling across town with a frigging oxygen cylinder on a bus, and then they sort of get in and she gives them a digestive biscuit and a cup of tea and says, right, you've done your exercise, go home, So the retention of people on these courses is very poor, and actually just even attending them is very challenging as well. So that's another big factor. But I think, having enough trained workforce, it's a very intensive intervention, right? So, so it's quite shocking, really, that actually what is quite a simple intervention is so poorly served everywhere, really, in the world. I think in Saudi Arabia, I think the stat was, I think there's one hospital provider of rehab in the whole of Saudi. It's crazy. So the idea of the product, so this is one of the applications, this is where we started really, is, well, what actually, if we could deliver rehab in the comfort of somebody's home, could we increase both uptake and adherence to that intervention and take the capacity from 3% to 70-80%, and then reduce hospital admissions from that cohort by half? It's that simple. And it turns out that people really like it. And we got some data that says, certainly people in lower socioeconomic bands, you see improved healthcare utilization as a result of using the app, and better outcomes. And we've got randomized clinical trials where we've shown non-inferiority versus in-person rehabilitation. So, on key outcome measures like 6-minute walk tests, things like that. And big improvements in inhaler technique as well. Something like, I think it's 70% of all inhaled medication is wasted because people don't take them properly. And so we've shown through our RCTs that we can correct 70% of those inhaler use errors just through simple structured education. So at its core, that's a good example of how the app works. So we sort of then expanded it from just pulmonary rehab to kind of structured education, medication management, anxiety management, a lot of other sort of holistic stuff, dietary advice, nutrition. And we built this really nice little personal assistant that will curate content and give it to the right person at the right time in the right context. And that's what it does. And these very simple digital nudges can have an enormous impact on people's quality and longevity of life. And we can do it at scale because we're just distributing electrons, right? We're not having to ship stuff.
Well, it sounds like a not simplistic, because I know a lot of effort's gone into it, but going back to what you said, it's like the more simple the solution for the end user and the patient, the more uptake you get from it. And a lot of the things you're describing, it's like, it sounds simple. If people are to do more and have more awareness of the different rehabilitation, then having an app that goes alongside it seems like absolutely the logical solution. As well as managing all of these other pieces, anxiety, managing asthma. It sounds like it's this it almost sounds over simple for what I'm sure the impact is. Who's actually incentivized to do this apart from the patient? Because, without getting into some thoughts on how some health systems are set up and how they make money versus others, who's the one who's really paying for this? And I guess who really wants to implement it?
Well, it's been a long road. So in the NHS, we have the integrated care boards usually, or the trusts, paying for it, and the motivation is around addressing health inequalities, which is a very big NHS priority, as well as a shift to prevention. which is quite a consistent theme in the various 10-year plans that have come out, most notably the most recent one. And a sort of an increasing realization that virtual wards, where a lot of the digital money was going, is quite an expensive and unwieldy thing to do any kind of scale. So we've been kind of the beneficiary of that. We've been sort of banging this prevention drum for 10 years. I mean, I haven't. I think I'm going insane by now if I'd have been doing that. Like, it was Thomas Simon. But they've been banging away at that. And the technology was the first digital technology to be reimbursed in the NHS through something called the Innovation Technology Tariff. That was back in 2018, I think, 2019, something like that. Where the NHS just bought a ton of licenses, and then we got contracts with everyone, and sort of some distributed, some didn't. It was, classic sort of distribution challenge. And then since then, through the randomized clinical trials, and we have what's called a NICE early value assessment approval for pulmonary rehabilitation, and also another one for self-management. So, and this is me referring to the foundations, right? The foundations are 7-8 years of clinical trial work. It's, doing the hard yards on the NICE approval. It's building up a model for true scale, and working out, like, operationally, how do we do that? If you run a tech company that just chops licenses at the NHS, they'll just bounce straight back, as we have seen happen in some areas. So, we provide quite a holistic sort of workforce around that. So, you say it sounds simple, but the complicated part is in the validation of products and producing a body of evidence that's compelling enough that the clinicians will sit up and take notice, but also coming out of that, you have to fashion health economic arguments that are compelling too. And to your point, I think what you're alluding to is that the more upstream you go in prevention, the longer it takes to see the outcome. I mean, number one, you need that clinical validation. So, and you can't, and that means randomized controlled trials, right? That means you need to be running, proper, frankly expensive, control arm, test arms, recruiting patients, the whole show. And we've run 4 of those now. And you can't speed that up. So, what you see with a lot of other digital companies is they'll go to market, they'll get their class 1 or their class 2A or whatever, and sort of have a smattering of clinical evidence, but it doesn't have that rigor, that you would need to get full health economics justified reimbursement. So that's what I was talking earlier about, building the foundations, right? So rather than try and take a shortcut to market, I just go, hey, we've got a cool thing. People seem to like it. People are using it. That you kind of get engagement metrics, but the evidence, you can do it by 2 ways, right? You can either do it through clinical trials, or you can do it through real world evidence. But real world evidence obviously requires scale. So we are now in quite a virtuous circle where, we spent the 8 years, 9 years doing that clinical evidence. And then that was enough to get us to the point where we got the reimbursement through the Innovation Technology Tariff, which then allowed us to scale quite dramatically, which in turn has allowed us to look at the data and look at the outcomes at a population scale and say, well, actually, this really does work. And then here are the ways of use. And so it was kind of through all that got us to the NICE early value assessment approval for both pulmonary rehab and self-management. And then really we're sort of now kind of going through the motions of going integrated care board and doing these kind of big deals. But, there's a lot of legwork selling into the NHS, as I'm sure you've heard in the past. So, we can go everywhere, really. We can go into primary care where they just give us lists and our digital health advisors will just onboard people at scale. So, we've done that in places like Bristol, for example, or Cambridge. Or there's specific use cases where, like post-discharge, where when a patient comes out of hospital, they're given the app as part of their fundamentals of care, go and do your smoking cessation, go and do your rehab, go and do your healthtech training, all that kind of stuff. So that's actually a very defined point in the process where you'll get it. And there's loads of other scenarios of use as well. And then sometimes we contract kind of over and above the primary care and the trusts and the community care with the actual integrated care board region, where we basically say, deploy where you want, we'll work with your clinical teams to make sure it's embedded in the pathway. So that's how the NHS works. The US is a completely different ballgame. Generally you have 2 options, well, 3 options. You can either go for dedicated reimbursement based on your health economics, which is like a really long path of like negotiating with CMS and the payers. Or you could go down the value-based routes and sort of negotiate deals where basically you get paid by outcomes. There are some examples of that, but generally that's sort of a second order thing. The route that most of our technologies are taking now is in what's called RPM and RTM codes. So remote patient monitoring, remote therapeutic monitoring. RTM is where we set. So it has to be a medical device, which it is. And there are certain restrictions on the use. So the patient has to use it for 16 days before you can bill against a setup code. And then there's a data collection code that, once the patient has hit 16 days of data in a calendar month, or was it in a 30-day period, you can bill again. And then the final one is communication. So any sort of review of the data or communication with the patient about the data can be billable too. In a nutshell, we've gone to the US market. Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services have said we will reimburse medically regulated technology that essentially that the patient's using, right? And so our main customer is the healthcare provider. So we'll go to the US healthcare provider and we'll say, look, you're frustrated because your patients aren't getting a therapy that they need. It's in the guidance. And so, one of the reasons they're not getting that therapy is because the centers that you would refer them to don't exist, right? They just don't exist. And even if they did exist, crudely, you wouldn't get paid for that. Someone else would get paid for that. So actually this product is a catalyst for you to get an entirely new revenue stream while ensuring patients get a validated therapy that they know they need. And then, the other thing that comes up a lot, especially when I talk to investors, is like, oh, well, there's a really perverse incentive. Like, healthcare providers don't want to reduce readmissions because that costs them money. Can I swear on this podcast?
Yeah, please do.
Shit. It's bullshit objectively because most of these patients are Medicare or Medicaid patients, so like 70% of them are. And if your readmission rates are higher than average, you can actually get fined up to 3% of your Medicare revenue if you're getting too many 30-day readmissions. So not only can we generate a new revenue stream for the physicians, because the CPD patients make up such a large cohort of those readmissions, you can actually avoid big penalties as well. So from whatever angle you look at this, it's the sort of the classic triple win. Patients get what they need, providers get paid a reasonable rate, and they save some penalty money, and the payers are happy because patients are more happy and well controlled, and they don't cost as much overall. So it's quite a nice set of incentives lining up. But the incentive structures in the US are completely different to the incentive structures in the UK, and navigating that is not trivial.
Yeah, 100%. And look, if we weren't having as many technical difficulties, I'm sure we could sit here for another half an hour. So I want to give you the opportunity to share one thing you want the audience to know about mhealth and what's coming from the next stage. And after that, thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, you put me on the spot.
Everyone says that.
Yeah. So, the one thing I think I'd like people to take away from this is, just because technology is involved doesn't mean it has to be complicated. And by keeping it simple, sometimes you can actually make a huge difference to an enormous number of lives in a way that you couldn't if you developed a really fancy thing. And I think that's the essence of what we're trying to do. We're trying to produce a scaled solution that, really reduces the burden on healthcare and really helps entire populations of patients. And I think that's what sets us apart, and I think that's what makes us unique. And I really wish other people thought more like that, because I think the world would be a better place.
Phenomenal. David, thank you so much for joining me.
It was a pleasure, Henry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining me on the Crux of Medtech podcast. If you're not already doing so, please go ahead and subscribe on YouTube or follow the podcast on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is proudly brought to you by Crux. Crux is a medtech search firm which places pioneers in transformative roles to help us live longer, healthier lives. We do 3 things for companies. We help hire world-class executive talent, We help companies raise investment from Series A to Series C and execute upon M&A. And we also are building a community of medtech leaders to facilitate peer-to-peer learning and accelerate the companies to help them go faster. If you're interested in any of those three things, please reach out to me on LinkedIn or follow the link in the show notes to find out more. Thank you.